Hello, everyone. Like you heard, I am Jaimie Quaglino. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Senior Manager of Archive Services at Gates Archive, and I will be your moderator for Session 4, The More You Know, like the rainbow, like the PSA, when information becomes knowledge. That was intentional. So I'm super excited for the panel and the interactive discussion that we have prepared for you today. Each panelist is going to share success stories from their experience with a focus on innovation, productivity, and collaboration. The session will, I mentioned it's interactive, so it will offer multiple opportunities to generate conversation with both for the panelists to respond to each other's stories and also for the audience to reflect and discuss takeaways, thinking about what they might bring home, what you all might bring home to your organizations. So how is this all going to work? Rest assured, there's a plan. So an outline of what we're going to do together for the next hour. So the panel section will be 30 minutes. Each panelist will present for 5 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes hearing feedback amongst themselves. Therese will be keeping time. Thank you, Therese. And you have homework as the audience. So as the panelists are talking, we want you to think about, gosh, okay, this seems really actionable. I want to file this away. Or, great idea, but I don't think I could do this. This seems really hard. And think about why that is, especially if it's something you know you want to do. So you have a little homework to keep some active note-taking. After the panelists complete, we'll give you some time to reflect and then talk amongst your tables. So you'll have a chance to discuss, your insights and reflections, and then we'll offer space to share that back and ask questions of our panelists. Oh, and I did not use this handy slide I created. There you go. That's the agenda I just talked about. No quiz. And these are the things you should think about. And panelists. Who are our panelists? Okay. So I'm going to introduce everybody, and just thanks to everybody for graciously offering your time and expertise. I'm going to introduce folks in the order that they're presenting. So first, and I'm going to talk about what they're going to speak to, and also a little bit about them, because I like context. I'm an archivist, and it's good to know a little bit more about the people that are before you. So first, we're going to hear from Gabi Fitz, the principal from Think Twice, LLC. Gabi will be sharing a story with us about work she did with a family foundation which had committed to the more intentional use of past lessons, but didn't yet have the learning and knowledge capture practices in place to have consistently documented those stories in the past. So she's going to describe the low-tech approach she used to capture those stories long after the fact. Some more information about Gabi. Gabi started Think Twice in 2018 to help social change organizations better manage and mobilize their data and knowledge. She made the move to consulting after 10 years of co-founding and co-directing Issue Lab, one of the social sector's largest open access repositories, now run by Candid. Her consulting practice is grounded in helping organizations center equity in their knowledge management practices and systems, recognizing that knowledge management is not a values-neutral activity. And last but not least, she lives in Chicago with her partner, 4 cats. I'm still very impressed, and 2.5 million other people. Okay, and then our next panelist will be Danita Volkving, Senior Director of Member Engagement, Philanthropy New York. Donita will be speaking about a knowledge transfer process that leverages relationship building and trust. It was co-developed by John Hubble from Tactical, say that 5 times fast, LLC, and relies on oral knowledge capture. The process can branch the discussion into a multitude of directions. Who decides whose knowledge is worth capturing? How can the process be made more equitable? And, of course, getting the importance of leadership buy-in. More about Danita. Danita is an opera singer by training. And being on stage is where she learned the importance of tacit relationship building, specifically the responsibility that is shared between performers and audience to create the magic of transformational communication. I love that. And then our last panelist will be Barbara Shubinski, Director of Research and Engagement at the Rockefeller Archive Center. Barb will speak about a data visualization project she's running based on a segment of the Rockefeller Archive Center's archival paper records and the associated learnings. These span from exploring institutional capacity for digital transformation to thinking about what it would take to broaden an established research community and better serve a wider range of methodologies and disciplines. She'll also speak to the ways the project has allowed her to explore how to use records in new ways that don't rely on the grant maker to raise up the experience of grantees and potential grantees. More about Barb. She is a dog person, particularly big dogs. And she has training in anthropology, historic preservation, and American studies. And she also used to work in nonprofit theater. Now that you've met everyone, let's dive in. Gabi, why don't you take it away?
Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. So I'm going to tell a story. I don't know if I would say it's a success story necessarily. It's just a story about some work that I did with the Family Foundation. And I want to preface it with a couple of things about why this story. Like, it could be a million different stories. But one, it's decidedly non-technical. So that does not mean that it couldn't be done better with more technology, or it couldn't be accelerated with the right technology, but it can be done totally without any technology. So that is important for many different reasons. I also picked it because I think it's almost universally doable. So small organization, large organization, existing function, non-existent function, I think it's something we can all do. And then the last thing is that it's sort of close to my heart because it makes new knowledge, if we want to call it that, out of old data. So I think that's something that we're all sort of in one way or another working on. And it's something that's at the heart of how I think about knowledge management, really as a responsibility to the people who've come before us and the people who come after us to use what's already there. So this is the story, the context, or the, what was it, instigating event? Or yeah. So mid-sized family foundation, and they were at an inflection point. And the inflection point was that they had decided to shift their strategy to more explicitly center themselves as an anti-racist organization and centering racial equity. And so that meant a change not only in what they were funding, but a change in the way they were working, a change in their operations, and they were very explicitly committed to the fact that operational activities were not values neutral, and so that's how I ended up working with them. And they had begun to develop some practices, and we'd done this together, around what do knowledge management and learning practices look like when and if they centered equity. And so they were at this moment, they were about to kind of turn a corner if they were going to do it right, and they wanted to make sure that they stopped and reflected about how they'd gotten there, so that it wasn't just sort of presumed that they'd either always been at that way of thinking or it was so easy to get there. So they really had this sort of moment of reflection, but they didn't have the practices in place yet, so they hadn't done the kind of reflection in the past. So what I ended up doing is something really simple, actually, and something that I think is universally doable, because I just went to their board minutes as like the most comprehensive, most consistently captured artifact, and one that they were obligated to collect. And largely they were obligated to collect it because the people in that room were considered important enough to take notes on and listen to. Right? So whatever we think about that, like whether we think they're that important or not, is sort of, I'll address that in a second, but they had captured the notes at least. They'd captured the minutes. The other thing that they'd done, which is sort of incredible, and I didn't realize it at the time, is that those minutes were freely accessible to all their staff. So I just sort of, coming from like an open access bubble, in my own universe, was like, oh yeah, of course they are. I work with organizations all the time that no one has access to those board minutes, and I find that kind of incredible. And as a consultant, they also showed this incredible level of trust that was like, you've signed the NDA, we've decided to work with you, here's the raw material. We're not gonna like drip it out to you and you tell us, and we tell you what's important enough to read. So that was kind of the setting and the context. So what I did was super simple. I basically took the board minutes. I had a set of learning questions around a particular set of programmatic strategies, like food insecurity or early childhood education. And I basically went to the board minutes and I started a table and I just said, what are the milestones that I'm seeing? What are the turning points? What are the discussion topics? And where does it feel like something else is happening in these minutes, but it's confusing, which was also, as an outsider, sort of something I brought to it that I think is harder to do as an insider. So there were clearly things that it was like, there's no way this has not been discussed before. Like, all of a sudden, there's this pivot in the minutes. So I would flag those. And then what I basically did is I took those flags and I interviewed people who were on staff now or people who'd been on staff and said, what's the story behind the story here? And that was sort of the premise. I got 2 seconds left or something? Yeah. Okay, awesome. So that was the premise, and essentially that became sort of like the prompt to people to say, let's make sense together of something that happened in the past when you didn't bring awareness and sensitivity necessarily to whose story mattered and who was in the room, then let's invite it now, and that it's not too late to do that. So that's the story. Yeah, that's what I got for you. All right.
Awesome. So Danita, Barb, anything resonate with you, what you heard from Gabi?
So I'm interested in the relative success of the flagging. Like, did those moments hold up? Did they provoke the kind of engagement that you were expecting? Were there any surprises to that sharing process?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is obvious in a way, but the richness of what came back to me often depended on the proximity of the people I was interviewing to power. So if they felt like, oh, there was another story happening, but I was sort of close to the room where it was happening, it had a different quality to it than people who felt like, I didn't know what was happening over there, but this is what was happening for me at the time, which I felt like was also an important and interesting story to be told and to be heard. The other piece is that we then shared those stories openly with all the staff. So I think, well, I'll stop there. I was going to answer a question you didn't ask. So.
No, I think my question is leading you to this edition.
Okay. Version 2 would be to further engage people then with those stories, which kind of makes me think about some of the work you've done around Depart, and I won't steal your thunder, but I think this sort of like taking it a step further, the sense-making process, and saying, now that these stories in response to the prompt, what are they hearing in these second stories? Would probably be another way to further engage people that I didn't do at the time, or that they weren't as invested in at the time. Yeah.
Did you notice any changed behavior or changed action items as a result? Like, did they actually learn from their own past?
Yeah. So I'm happy to say yes, but I don't think just because the story was collected. It was because we were designing a new set of reflective practices that asked at the beginning of projects, what in our organization have we done that's kind of like this? And what can we learn from that? And so even that prompt started people to start saying yeah, and there was that thing that happened, right? Or one of the big things was how much work was happening behind the scenes on bringing the family along, actually. And that it was 10 years of this really intimate work with them. And so that often comes up where we'll say, as we're grounding at the beginning of a project, is this something where we're gonna have to do some more of that work, right? Or it made that work visible in a way that can't be so easily skipped over in the future. So yeah, thanks. Yeah, so they're committed to the practices. And so now they're not having to do as much of the retroactive,
You have a word for this process, story harvesting or something like that?
organ harvesting.
It is a little like I've actually done story harvesting's a little different, and it's not my term. It's actually, but it's a methodology I've started to use, which is where you really ask people to come with a story about a particular, in response to a particular prompt, have other people listen to that story, and then make sense together of what was in the story. And then also often in that case, people say, well, actually, I have a totally different story about what happened. It like opens up that, invites that, yeah.
So the thing that you gathered through the flagging and the stories, did that then join the official records of this mid-sized family foundation?
Yeah, yeah. So
There's a practice called Save the Last Word for Me. Have you heard of this? Cardozi Jones of True North EDI does this a lot, which is, you read a story, whether it be on racial equity or on succession stories, and each person, there's a group of 4, chooses like a passage that particularly resonates. So if I chose the passage and I would read it to the 3 of you, then I would go to Barb first and say, Barb, why do you think I chose that? Barb would tell me, and then I would go to Jaimie, and I'd ask Jaimie, you guys get the idea. And then the last person to speak is me, to say why I actually chose that story. And it teaches such a lot about, we try to finish other people's stories a lot. And having that brought home to you as a participant in that practice of, wow, that was absolutely not the right thing, and that was absolutely not what was chosen. It just asks you to interrogate even further.
Well, and I think that's it, basically, is like this sort of single source of truth thing that I think a lot of us are trying to respond to. I think like getting more nuanced about that and saying there's like an official record. Truth is like a whole different thing, right? And that is like, we do need to have a trusted official record. People need to know it's the final version. Do they need, but to call it the truth is a whole different ball of wax, yeah. So.
Okay. We're going to move on now to Danita.
Hello.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Therese, if I go over, just stop me.
I'll interrupt you.
Thank you.
Kindly.
I love it. I feel like I cheated a little bit because you got to see part of the practice on the slide that wasn't. But the important thing because I love, both of us have very low-tech ways of gathering knowledge. And this is not, I have to go on record to say I love process, I love technology, believe me. But when they're used to enhance and not to cause trauma. Process and technology have caused so much trauma in your organizations, and that needs to stop. A lot of people will be uncomfortable having sweaty conversations, and I have to tell you, I'm really sweaty right now, which means that I'm doing the work that I should be doing. And so instead of having the sweaty conversation, they throw a process at it. So instead of just talking to somebody, you get a 52-page document that makes you not have to talk to somebody. If we can actually just talk to each other and then have a 1-page document that captures the actual process, how much easier would our lives be? So the knowledge transfer thing was, so John Hovel and a partner of his at Stratactical, it is a white man's word. You don't hear black women going with Stratactical, right? And I'm sorry to the white men. I have some white men friends. Please don't be mad. John taught this to me, and I was like, this is so amazing. And it's going to be the thing that fixes everything. High Gartner Hype Cycle, for those of you who love the Gartner Hype Cycle as much as I do. It did not fix everything. What we did was take this person, he was an EVP who had been in the sector for 40 years, and he was able to impart his knowledge. And I thought this was going to be such a great thing. The 5 of us, no, it was the 6 of us because I was the facilitator. It takes about 12 hours over the course of however many months you have. And there was such a font of information because not only was Chris sharing his story, but then everybody in the room was like, oh, wow, I do that so differently. And then other people would say, I do too, but I kind of like the way that's doing it. And so that innovation and that practice, sitting in the same room with the EVP, for the people who were 15, 20 years away from that position, it was so empowering. And what it meant was that one of the things that I haven't heard a lot about is how much we hold in our bodies, right? Like the best source of knowledge, like stuff, is in your bodies because we are the people who are using or misusing process and technology. So, like, why not talk to the bodies first instead of trying to go find it in a file somewhere, right? So every session, I would take notes that I would do, like, on an Excel spreadsheet, y'all, because they tried to do it where people would just impact, but it was the magic of having the people in the room who would do this together. And I came out with a 32-page report that touched on every part of the organization. Suggestions for how, like better practices, suggestions for equity, all that kind of stuff. And it was completely ignored. Yay! 12 hours with 6 people in the room. And what I heard and what I learned over and over is that we don't actually want to hear the answers to the questions that we're asking. And so, Bob was talking about telling our own stories. And listen, like, as a person of color, we've been trying to tell our own stories for decades. But people don't want to hear those stories because it makes them the bad guys. And when you cannot put yourself in a position to understand the harm and trauma that you have caused, there is no change possible. So, I still benefited from this amazing practice, as did the other people in the room, but we weren't able to share it further. But that knowledge stayed in the organization in the form of the bodies that could witness to it.
I think we're right on time. That's a good place to stop. Barb, Gabi, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm a little stuck on the 12 hours, and like I'm sort of tactically interested in how you got them to do 12 hours, but I think I'm more interested in what you think in retrospect are like the necessary conditions for that work to have actually stuck, or actually, right? Like, what's missing? Is it like, is it 12 hours that's missing? Is it listening skills? Is it, like, what is it that, yeah.
Well, thank you for asking that, because there was another part that I wanted to say, because I taught this to another friend of mine who is also in a nonprofit. And we went over the things. She's like, Donita, that's completely inequitable. And I was like, you're right. So she adapted it for her organization to make it a much more equitable thing that was equitable for her organization, right? And so when John did this with BAE and Lockheed Martin, I think, he went and said, if you let me run 10 teams, I'm going to save you $1 million. BAE and Lockheed Martin were like, yeah. Nonprofits, not so much. Like, why can we not spend 12 hours talking to each other instead of spending $250,000 on a CRM that takes 5 years to implement, that causes trauma to most of your organization? Why do we put the emphasis on training somebody how to use a thing that they were never invited to opine on, even though they're the ones who are going to be using it the most, right? So it's about shifting that idea. And in fact, the reason that there was a woman who sued because she did not get into one of these sessions, or because she understood how much information, organizational information was there, but it needed the buy-in, again, of the top folks, because they're the ones who recognized, listen, if you can save us $191,000 every time we run this, and regardless of stratum of the person. And my friend Diana also was like, does this always have to be just when people are leaving?
Right.
I was like, no. Like, if you have people in your organizations that hold a unique bit of knowledge, or have been there for a long time, or the only person who knows how to use the fax machine, like, consider inviting them to do either this thing or a truncated version of it. Make it equitable for your organization, and then ask, like, whose story are we telling, and for what purpose?
Barb, any thoughts?
I have many thoughts. Some of them can come up later in our discussion, but I just wanted to follow on what Gabby was asking about, what maybe would have made this work more effectively. And I wanted to drill in on one aspect of it, which was not wanting to hear the answers to the questions that they had actually asked. So,
Oh, they wanted to hear the answers.
okay,
Senior leadership did not.
okay. Was senior leadership a stakeholder in the development of the questions themselves?
No, the stakeholders are the 5 people in the room.
So the senior leadership hadn't asked the questions?
Nope.
Or
Nope.
it directed the asking of the questions?
Nope. Because it wasn't their place. They were not aspirationals or professionals.
I see.
But also, that was the rub.
Right. Cool. Okay.
Wow. Okay. I think we can move on to our last panelist, and I'm going to ask Gabi and Danita to pass this clicker down to Barb so that she can click through her deck.
Great. Hi, I'm Barb Shubinski. I'm the Director of Research and Engagement at the Rockefeller Archive Center. And I'm going to tell you about a project that my team is currently engaged with that uses the historical records of the Rockefeller Foundation in a way that we haven't previously, and that we're sort of experimenting with and using as a demonstration project. First off, though, I just wanted to say a couple of things about what research and engagement does. Just very briefly, we do engagement with the Rockefeller Archive Center's donor organizations, which number over 40, with some major players sitting here in the room today: Ford Foundation, Knight Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, among others. We also give support for external independent scholarship and research. The RAC serves over 2,000 researchers a year, both in person and remotely, sometimes up to 4,000, sort of depending how you're counting. And that's a global constituency of researchers. And then thirdly, we do our own research as a team using the records held at the Archive Center. So a lot of our engagement with donors is around content, and then we also try to drive that as well with our own interests. So what this project is that I'm going to talk to you about is using a certain period of time in Rockefeller Foundation history, specifically the 1930s, in the Natural Sciences Division, and trying to turn typed paper analog documents into structured data. So this is a glimpse of what we're starting with. At the Rockefeller Foundation, which launched in 1913, it was common up through the 1970s, in fact required, for program officers to keep what was called an officer's diary. I should be clear, though, that diary is a little misleading in today's terms. It's not a record of deep thoughts and feelings. It's an activities log. Not all foundations have required their program officers to keep these. In some ways, this is a unique record set, though this type of activity log can be found across other foundations and just sort of named and filed differently. So what we did in selecting this time period was to take about 12,000 paper pages, scan and OCR them, and begin mining data out of them. Why did I pick this time period? I picked it in part because it's a time period of some renown in Rockefeller Foundation history, so I had a pretty good record of the story of this time period as detailed in a lot of secondary source, or primary source scholarship, secondary source scholarship that you can read, telling us the major contours of what happened. It's a much storied period in which the Rockefeller Foundation is the lead science funder in the world. It sits on top of about 15 years of experience to that point, building up the sciences in the US and Europe through fellowships and exchanges, as well as organizational grants. And it really shot both chemistry and physics forward by quite a lot. In 1932, a new director comes on to direct the Division of Natural Sciences. He wants to do something new, make his mark, move forward. And the 30s is kind of known as this time period of technology transfer, taking techniques from physics and chemistry, the more well-established and well-funded hard sciences, into the still emerging developmental area of the life sciences or biology. The capstone of this period is the Rockefeller Foundation's role in inventing the field of molecular biology. So we've got the big story. And we've got 12,000 pages of officer diaries as well as minute books from the Rockefeller Foundation. So as we mine the data out, what the data becomes is nodes. And we put it into a Neo4j knowledge graph that's interactive and queryable. And so we have about 1 million nodes of data at this point. As you can see up here, we've got grant files coming from the board of directors minutes into grants for specific purposes to organizations. We have persons who are either principal investigators or other contacts that the Rockefeller Foundation program officers talk to. We can then do data visualizations about the changes in scientific subfields over time. But perhaps more importantly, we can bloom topics and look at the evolution of scientific subtopics that are just starting to come into existence. We can also follow evolutions in grant making as new fields that haven't yet been conceptualized start to be named, and you can kind of track that with date progressions as you go along. Certainly, you can still center the experience of the program officer. You can see Warren Weaver right there in the middle. He's the pink circle. But as you look at every person that he talked to, you can see all the other types of information that accrue to that person. We wanted to look at tipping points in grant making. What does it take to get a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation? Do you have to know somebody? And if you already are a trusted grantee and you're telling Rockefeller Foundation program officers about promising new people, do they then follow through? Do these people become insiders? So we're really trying to get at the question of influence. You can see that central purple node is a person. It's Ted Svedberg, a famous physicist. The pink nodes are Rockefeller Foundation program officers, including all the natural science officers, but other program officers as well. So you can see that he's a frequent contact. And then the yellow ones are all the conversations and other people that he's bringing into that circle. And finally, one thing that you can ask of this type of inquiry, why do we do this? Really because I get a lot of questions about what kind of data we hold at the RAC. And often my answer when it comes to historical paper records is, it's not so much data as potential data, and someone's gonna have to make it data. But beyond that, and really more importantly, having things scanned and digitized and viewable is one thing, but Control-F only works with a question that you can track with your human brain. And I wanted to get at what could happen with these records if we want to ask truly multifactorial questions that can't be tracked no matter how many hours you have with your Excel spreadsheet or your pencil and notepad, right? And I wanted to get at the ineffables. Who's talking to whom? What stories aren't being told? We know the main storyline, but what we don't know is what's happening out there in that network of hundreds and thousands of other people that are coming into contact with potential funders for potential scientific innovations and breakthroughs. I also wanted to capture affect. There's a lot of talk that goes on about grantees and their qualities and sort of good bets, trustworthy investments, good organizations. And I wanted to be able to capture things that sort of don't pan out. So that's where we are with it, and I'll just send it back for discussion. Thank you so much.
Okay, Danita, Gabi, reflections on this?
Sometimes technology is good.
Right, totally. What do you mean I can't do it by hand? I've tried. So I'm wondering, did you see gaps actually between the official story and the stories that began to emerge in these patterns of who is talking to whom?
Yes, though I don't want to overstate it. I don't expect, this project is still in process, by the way. I expect it less to upend the master narrative than to complicate and expand it. I don't think I'm going to find out that the Rockefeller Foundation wasn't, instrumental in the development of molecular biology, right? I think that's fairly well established, as well as contested already in the secondary literature. But I do want to find out about people not named Niels Bohr, not named Ted Svedberg, right? Or I want to find out that things that have risen to the top, like there's a real famous story about the RF contributing to the development of penicillin. Come to find out, it was a tiny little grant and aid. In other words, a discretionary grant that program officers could make without it rising to the board level. And this story has become a really signal story at the foundation. So then that tells me something. I'm not trying to say it was less important because it was a grant and aid. I think what I'm trying to say from a records management point of view is understand the kinds of information that different record groups and types can bring to a query. And I think I'm also trying to say that 100 years on, this goes back to your point, Gabby, about trying to capture the truth. You just don't even know who's going to be looking at your proverbial piece of paper and for why. Right? So the thing that you're worried about, maybe your organization's maybe worried about on that piece of paper, might not even be the thing on the paper that someone's asking about because the categories have shifted. Nobody would have thought with these officers' diaries that we would remove them from the sort of overarching narrative of the program officer who's assessing everything. But if we take a data-driven approach, we can. So.
Did you say one more? Yeah. Okay. I mean, the other thing that just is like standing out to me, because it's, I think, the common thread between all three of our stories is this, like, the centrality of relationships, right? And the centrality of that it's people who mediate knowledge, right? It's people who mediate information and give it context. And at the same time, it's like, and when you said, why not ask the bodies, right, instead of the documents when those people are right in front of you? It also makes me think about all the network injustice, right? That like all of the exclusion, either from the room in who gets to listen to the stories, or even from these who didn't show up on the network map.
Or it kind of makes me think, when you said that about bodies, I thought about oral histories and people's experience and how changeable we are as humans, because we're always changing, right? And at first I thought about saying bodies are unreliable, but I didn't really like that because it's like, that's a don't trust your body kind of thing. That's not cool. I don't like it. But I read the other day, did you know the human head weighs 12 pounds? No. Something like that, though. Our taste buds completely change over in about every 3 weeks, right? So every 3 weeks, you have a different set of taste buds than you had 3 weeks ago. And it made me think about where people are when they give oral histories and where they were when they captured the thing in the records. So now I'm going to bring it home, and kind of uncomfortably, this last side captures a little bit of affect and gossip, really, in the records. So one of the ways that we capture this category of influence is the idea of talking with someone, to someone directly, and talking about someone who's not there. So tallying that becomes really important when you're trying to kind of get at major influencers. So this arrow is pointing to the relational arm that's called talked about. This is a conversation about several people, but ultimately it's assessing Robert Yerkes, sometimes known as the father of primatology. And what they're saying to him, about him up there is H, the person in the middle, says that Yerkes has done the animal husbandry of the chimp, but very little work of theoretical or basic importance. And Yerkes, becomes like the main person that big things are named after, but also a eugenicist. So his name's been taken off things that the Rockefeller Foundation funded. So he's both the father of primatology and a really problematic character. And here you're capturing this midstream view where none of that has come to fruition yet, right? His career's not established. The latter 20th century critique of eugenics isn't happening yet. Like, it's capturing this moment before the taste buds change over, right? And I think that's something of huge value.
And I'm sorry, Jaimie.
It's okay, Danita. Get it
Do you
in.
need to herd me?
Yeah, can you get it? You can get it in.
Okay.
Yep.
So I watch a lot of TV because it is my comfort place because I can't deal with people so much. And I was watching Reservation Dogs. Yeah, very, very different. Yeah, thank you, Moran. And this is how rumors get started. And there was this great episode. The kids are one of them gets beat up, and they go to an uncle to be taught how to fight. And they spend the whole day with him. And at one point, one of the kids is like, "You didn't teach us anything. Like, what the hell? Why are you doing this?" And he said, "We don't teach like the white people. We don't just write stuff down and expect you to read it. We embody it." And that struck home so much with me because, as we change, like our cells change every 7 years, right? So I'm a different person than I was 7 years ago or 7 years. I guess they don't change all at the same time, because then it would be like, I guess they change like,
Parts of us are changing.
Parts of us are changing at different times. I'm going to get thrown out of this conference. But to say that, we have to, somebody over there said it before about one of the huge questions that David Daniels at the Bynum Foundation asked. What do we need to acknowledge about our past before we can move forward? And that is a huge question, because part of looking back means seeing all of the things that you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning going, "Oh my God, in the 8th grade, I said to that guy that I liked, you're kind of stupid." And it lives with you, right? And accepting all of the ugly parts that you find along the way and capture them as the part of the growth that encourages you to be better as an individual, as a community, as a sector. And that's what it all is. We want a better sector because we need to do better, because we're doing the same old shit. Same old stuff, and having some of the same old conversations. Has the needle moved?
Yeah.
If it hasn't, why are we keeping this knowledge?
I think that's a good place to pause. Thank you, Danita. Okay, so we have about a little under 20 minutes left. So I think what we'll do, why don't we, Therese, do you mind just keeping a timer like 2 minutes? We want to let people, now that you have heard all of the panelists and you know the homework, if we could actually go to the next slide. I realize I don't have the clicker perfect. Yeah, so these are your discussion prompts. So just maybe for 2 minutes, just reflect quietly upon your notes, and then we're going to open it up. I'll let you know when 2 minutes are up, and then you can talk at your tables. Okay. Okay, everyone. We're going to wrap up our table conversations, and we're now going to segue into, we're going to combine the last two pieces. If we can go to the last slide. Going to have to, okay. Hello. Yeah, so we're now just going to open it up to all of the tables, to the audience. It sounds like you've been having really good conversations. So we'd like to offer you the chance to either share out something that came up in your table, or if you want to ask a question of our awesome panelists, either or, we can open it up. So just raise your hand, and then we'll use the mic like we have been doing for other panels. Who wants to break the ice? Oh, I didn't see you, Andrea. Please.
We were just talking about how quiet and shy I am. That's probably why you didn't notice my hand was up. We were talking about this. First of all, I don't know who came up with the term ghost processes, but it's brilliant and it's perfectly appropriate to sort of describe some of these things that happen and we don't know why. And so I was wondering if anyone had any insights about how one might go about identifying, calling out ghost processes and then obliterating them so that things are sort of more equitable and you know and everybody knows. Because what happens, right, is that you end up as an organization of exceptions and no rules, which the hives and I can't function in that kind of world. And so I would be very interested in hearing a little bit about that.
Oh, that just like gave me chills because it's two things, right? There are ghost processes that are the spit and duct tape of our organizations because when technology does not work, people find ways to go around it. And you know, you come in as a knowledge person, as an OD person, as a consultant, and you're like, let me put my stamp on this. This is not what was in the handbook. So we're going to take that ghost process away. In this instance, that's the ghost process. But it's like an old engine, right? You've got a fan belt that is 22 years old with some cracks in it and everything. You're like, oh, no, this can't be. So you replace the fan belt and don't understand that by replacing this one thing, you have now destroyed the ecosystem. And that car that could have gone for probably another 5 years is now going to die in 5 days. We don't acknowledge the fact that our technology is not equitable. It doesn't serve everybody, and that in order for people to be able to do their jobs, they have to go around it sometimes. And so when you take that process away, stuff stops. So that's the one ghost process. And then the other ghost process is you have to be at the organization for at least 2.5 years before you can be considered for a promotion. Oh, except for this guy, because he's got an MBA. That's the other ghost process that we don't acknowledge. Oh, but he's got an MBA. So that means he's a linear thinker and cannot think outside of his box. Some of my best friends are MBAs, please don't get me wrong. But it is, you know, we have policies, and we've come up across this in our organization at Philanthropy New York. By the way, 16 people on staff, budget of $2.7 million, and we make it work. We have 4,500 individual members, 280 organizational members that create the 4,500. So you've got folks that are, we're trying to understand, we wrote the policy, here's the policy. Well, but this doesn't, the policy is the same, but how it gets applied has to be different. Because we have a policy, for example, that we're in 2 days a week. If you are feeling at all sniffly, you stay home, regardless of what's happening. There are some people in the organization who have seasonal allergies and who are not sick. They're not going to give you anything, but the process of getting into the office is going to make them cranky and not as able to do their work. So it's the same policy, but it has to be implied. It has to be seen through the lens of humanity.
The only thing I'd add to that, so I don't know if ghost processes are related to shadow systems, but I feel like they are.
They're cousins.
Yeah. And I actually, I do a lot of discovery with organizations, and as part of that process, I very explicitly seek out shadow systems. And I seek them out not to obliterate them, actually. I seek them out because they're examples of adaptation. And sometimes they're adaptation to things in the system that frankly stink, and we need to address them. And sometimes they're adaptations to poor implementation of technology. Sometimes they're all kinds of adaptations. But I think I very consciously am like, I invite these other stories, these alternative processes, these alternative systems, because there's data in that resistance, and let's not design it out. So I think if we can listen for the story, the system, the ghost, the shadow first, and then think about what we want to do with it, like separate those two things, not listen for obliteration. I think it's sort of how I've started thinking about it. Whereas I used to just be irritated, right? But I mean, that's the magic of being a consultant, is you're like paid for different reasons than when you work somewhere. You're just irritated when you work there. You're paid to figure it out, and you're like, that's so interesting, right? So, yeah, that's how I've come to think about it, yeah.
That's brilliant.
Okay, I think, was there another question over here? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, can pick it up. Okay, so I'm going to share, we had a very similar experience just about having sweaty conversations, and specifically how the more sweaty conversations you have, the less sweaty they actually become or are. And for two of us at the table, our groups had actually, both cross-functionally and within our teams, done training sessions around listening, feedback, et cetera. And so having a shared lexicon with each other just really allows you to name it, and also takes the sweatiness away of just like, we're going into this thing that we've learned together and we're going to try it, and maybe a little clunky. But that felt like an easier place to start. I've also worked in a former organization where they were very feedback focused, but there was also no shared lexicon or anything put in place. And it was just kind of like the Wild West of feedback, which is definitely a sweaty place to be in. So even though it's very time consuming and expensive, of course, to get people all together across functions in different states, countries, we've really seen it be, a really helpful process.
Nice.
Okay, I think we have, there's throwing stuff. We have 2 minutes. Any final thoughts, questions, anything you want to share out? Or if nothing in the room, any final, see, hands went up. Okay, go for it.
When you prepared the relationships, how did you transfer the information from the documents to data that you could then, where you could show the relationships?
We use a contracting partner who has created an interface with Neo4j and their workflow. What's kind of interesting is that this is a 2-phased project, and the divide between the 2 phases marks the rise of GPT and generative AI. So for the entire first phase, we mined everything and we used natural language processes and techniques to try to teach the machine how to recognize relationships. This is super tricky because of just syntactical variation and all the exceptions. And here's the 11 ways that somebody might say, so-and-so works on this, or so-and-so talked about that. And GPT is kind of cleaning up the noise in this graph, with amazing fidelity. So basically everything in the graph, we set the nodes, and then we set the types of relationships that we're looking for. And the 2 basic types of relationships are among people are talked to or talked about, and then vis-a-vis science are works on, study of, research in. And then we sort of give GPT the prompt engineering to recognize all the variations on that.
Do we have time for one more?
100%, yeah.
Okay. Did you want to ask your question?
I also was just going to mention, Barbara, that your work is so fascinating to me. And is this an initial pilot project, and do you have a plan for this? Meaning, will you partner with other maybe fellowships or institutions, maybe even the partner institutions that the archives that you're containing, or well beyond that, computer science people that would be so interested in this, and then also partnering with the content and the data that's extracted, could
Yes.
be white papers, et cetera.
Yeah. Yes, it is a pilot demonstration project, and it's meant to do a couple of things. It's funded right now on grant money from the Rockefeller Foundation. They are, as you might imagine, by and large, interested in questions about grant making, networks, influence. But obviously there's scientific research content in here as well, sort of content that will end up with a body of data that's interesting, I think, to researchers in the history of science. One kind of crazy thing is that, science believes it's always moving forward. So it's not really that interested in history in the sense of no one's going to say, let's go run that experiment again. How about the 4 humors? Let's take a look. We might have been wrong. No one's saying that, right? So finding a taxonomy of scientific terms historically is actually really difficult, and there aren't many. So one sort of just side product of this project is because the RF was the lead science funder in the world, you can somewhat rest assured that if they're funding it, that's the science that's happening. And so it's generating a taxonomy. So the project kind of wears 2 hats, the content research hat and just the proof of concept hat. And I want to talk about the second one just because I think it's more salient to this group. I was talking to our head of digital strategies at a certain point in phase 1, and he said, gee, it's really too bad. This is just it's so cutting edge and interesting, but it's too bad you have to kind of already know your research questions when you get to the project. And this was the light bulb moment for me, because I was just like, pause, pew. No, because all grant making is the same, more or less, classic grant making. I'm not talking about new financial mechanisms, but that kind of mid 20th century till now, big pool of money, earns interest, program strategies, trustees who say yay or nay, program officers who develop the strategies and identify the grantees, they receive money for topics that they work on. Those nodes, which is when I showed you the overall grant schema, those are the same across the board. So that second hat has hopes towards reaching to our other donor organizations and others to say, particularly those with paper records and long-term histories, to try to think of how they can do work on data. And the reason for that is that, one of the reasons is that with more and more records being born digital, that is data already. That's structured data kind of inherently. So Barb's sci-fi future is that researchers could ask a question that spans the historical paper era into the contemporary era, and as long as you're setting your terms with some fidelity, and you kind of know what your pros and cons are, because terms change, that you could ask a question with continuity from paper records into born digital records, that you could get them somehow on the same footing where that vast body of paper records becomes able to be in conversation with dams and what they spit out at us, right? So that's kind of the big thing.
Are you running any?
Oh, it's here. Okay.
Are you running any? Have you done any piloting with digital born data yet? It's just making me think about right? Isn't that
Digital born, that just sounds that sounds like sci-fi future
Born
too.
digital
born
data.
digital?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know
we
why
are
I hate to
actually,
make
we're
it.
working with the data science team inside the Rockefeller Foundation as they run similar work using a knowledge graph on data from their dam, which is called Atlas. So we're able to sort of look at what they're trying to do and be like, those are the same questions we're asking in 1936. And then we're going to do some user testing with historians of science on just the content data. So from the Archive Center point of view, one of our goals is to broaden our research community. Because the paper records are paragraphs and paragraphs of narrative form writing, it's been easiest for the researchers who come from a narrative history point of view. And we haven't been able to serve people who are more quant-driven quite as readily, sociologists, political scientists, economists, and so forth. Those are the phone calls about what kind of data do you have? And I'm like, we have potential data, 2 linear miles of it, in fact, just in this collection alone, right? So, yeah, I guess the project is meant as an exploration to bridge all sorts of gaps, I guess.
Okay, I think we're at time. Thank you, everyone.
Does anybody have any more questions? Because we do have a short sort of networking activity, but if anybody wants to keep talking about this, we can do that too.
I kind of wanted also to throw it back to you two, because one thing that we had Kismet on was different voices, different groups, authority in the records, kind of. Because I thought that's where we all connected.
Yeah, that's right.
I will say I vented my spleen earlier about the fact that, there are so many stories that we haven't taught people how to hear them, and say they don't matter as much, and they should matter probably even more, because we are used to hearing stories in a certain format, and we are used to learning in a certain format. And you had mentioned something about not being able to be a learner, and I think we're so wedded to the fact of being the expert in the room in philanthropy that we cannot sit back and go, hey, I don't understand what that is. Because if and I've had personal experience with this, if as a woman of color I say, I don't know what that means, then somebody is going to say, oh, God bless her. We tried affirmative action, it didn't work. When I didn't, so I have fought a long time to try and fit my stories into the templates that get furthered. And at some point I realized that I have tried as hard as I can, and now I just have to teach people how to hear my voice. And the voices of other people like me, and the way we process our brains. And I'm not even talking about necessarily race or gender, but even big visionary thinkers versus people who are just so happy in the minutia, introvert preferences versus extrovert preferences. This world is built for extroverts. Introverts had a moment during the pandemic proper, and we found a whole new category of a way to be that is now being dictated to us by extrovert preferences that is wrong. And we're losing the productivity and the thought leadership and the ideas that are coming out of minds that finally have some silence around them.
What are my thoughts? I don't know why I keep hiding this guy down here. I'm thinking about a bunch of things, but I'm thinking, it just what you were just talking about, I would also throw in there, I think, around disability inclusion.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing already with the return to the workplace or conferences, or where we're just, it's like, it was such a incredibly instant, radical reimagining of what we've been told wasn't possible for years and years and years. And it was like, oh shit, I guess it is possible. And now 2 years later, we're like, I don't think that's possible. And it's like, how do we, that's another dimension of the same thing that I was just sitting here thinking about. But
Well, I've been so interested today seeing how the structure of the workplace and the structure of the records, right? Like both conversations have been going on, that how efficiency or clarity within your organization, has direct relationship to that in your record holdings. So I guess as the person who doesn't have any agenda, because I'm the one who like gets to act like a researcher in the holdings. So I'm looking for your ghost processes. I don't want your records. I want your records to be neat. But I don't want them to be too neat because there lies the interest factor, right? So I think this moment that you're talking about, we'll see it in the records eventually as clearly as we can see the disappearance of the secretarial pool.
Yep.
Because how do you think all those officers' diaries got typed? It was not by the officers.
Or written, probably, in many cases, too, but yeah.
Yeah, well, they recorded it somehow, right?
Right.
But they didn't type it up on those sheets. I mean, I chose that record group in part because it's the most structured data you can find in the analog records. It looks super structured to our human eye. The computer's like, it's not that structured. But they were doing lots of things that it was an incredibly intensive labor process.
Right.
Underlining proper names, putting the date in the right place, making sure the grant number's tracking, conventions for shortening people's names to initials. I mean, so much stuff.
I see Andrea standing up over there, but
She's
I don't
like,
care.
okay, guys,
The music can
panel
play
4,
on. Yeah,
you have to go now.
But it brings up a great thing, which is that we continue to to document knowledge as if it were 20 years ago. Our workforce is changing tremendously. People are cycling in and out of our organization at a huge rate. And so like the secretarial pool, I'm not advocating for the secretarial pool to come back because, well, talk about equity, but who, those people held the voice of the foundation together. They were the ones who recognized the norms and who were able to like bring all of the disparate voices into one that was cohesive. We no longer have cohesive voices in our organizations, and it's hurting us a lot because we don't know what our own message is to broadcast.
Well, whatever voice in the organization, it's going to show up in the records. I mean, that's really just the thing. Okay. All right, is that a mic drop you're doing there? Really? Mic drop.
I think the mics have dropped. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
What a way to end the day. So just a couple of themes, relationships, the rise of evil technology, and the impending end of days. So I would watch Terminator this weekend, get some tips. What are the stories? Who wants to hear them? And again, for who and for what? I feel like that is a theme. So, all right. If you signed up for dinner, please meet at the restaurant you signed up for at the time indicated on the sign-up sheet. You can let the host or hostess know that you're there for the AFA conference, and they'll show you to your table. And we'll have a sponsor or sponsors at each restaurant just to help facilitate conversation. There are extra proceedings and notebooks in the back if you need to bring any back to your organization or you need extras. We will be meeting back in this space tomorrow at 9 a.m. for day 2. If you look on the back of your conference badge, you'll see a sticker. That color is your group for tomorrow. We're going to have 3 tracks for tomorrow. Each group will, at some point, be doing a self-guided tour of the Discovery Center. We'll be having a guided tour of the Gates Archive, or we'll be participating in our World Cafe, where we will have table discussions on some of the themes that emerged from today's work. But really, to wrap up, to really bring us home today, I have the very great pleasure of introducing Jack Myers, president of the Rockefeller Archive Center, and he is going to officially close out this first day of our conference. Jack?
Thanks so much, Andrea. I have lots of thanks to say, but on all of our behalfs for what happened today. But I felt as the head of a research archive, I had to end today to say just a few words about, where all this information, or at least a lot of the information that you're gathering, is, I hope, going to go someday, which is, to make it publicly available. That's what we do. We're open to researchers of all kinds. And I think there are just a couple points that I think are worth bearing in mind, using some words that have come up today. Two of the words we've heard a lot are accountability and transparency. And certainly nothing makes a foundation more accountable or transparent than opening their records for research. Accountability and transparency aren't quite I think in the foundation context, they don't quite mean the same thing. And permit me for a minute, just a historical example. The very first foundation that we can recognize as a kind of modern American foundation was founded by George Peabody in 1867, something called the Peabody Education Fund. And after the fund had been working for several years, they produced a report. And this was the first report ever produced by a foundation. And it makes absolutely fascinating reading because, they didn't know there weren't any rules for what this should look like. And they threw everything into this report. And it's accountable in the sense that it provides all the information about what the fund had done, what they'd funded, who they'd funded. But they also provided information about how they made their decisions, what their decision-making process was like, how they developed their strategies. And when I looked at this, and I thought, wow, this is so amazing, because never again, I think, did a foundation ever put in its report information like that. How are we doing what we do? How are we thinking? This is a kind of, the accountability is always there, where everybody's telling you what they do. But how to do it, it kind of disappeared. But it comes back again when an archive becomes publicly accessible. And that's when that kind of transparency becomes much more apparent. The other word that I picked up a lot on today, and it's in the title of the conference, is community. Foundations are they're part, if you can see from Barb's charts, it's an ecological system, right? I mean, our grantees are as much part of that ecology as anything. And I think that, again, foundations sometimes forget that when researchers come to their archive, many of them will be interested in the foundation, most of them will not. Most of them are coming to those archives because of all the grantees and the work of those grantees. That's what they're really trying to find out. And, as a byproduct of what a foundation does, they collect vast amounts of information about their grantees. Your records are amazing repositories of tens of thousands of organizations and people around the world. And that's really what our researchers are looking for. In most cases, that's one of the most important things. It's because, it's important to remember that it's all part of that community. So I just want to tie that back into why we're doing these meetings, which is, in a sense, to establish a community of our own. And I want to thank everybody who was involved in pulling this together, because I think I'm really beginning to feel like we are part of a community here, and that we can rely on each other. And I'm just especially grateful to our hosts, to the Gates Foundation, to Gates Archive, to the organizing committee for making this community really possible. So thank you very much.
You are free to go.